Hi, everyone. Thank you. I do live in Los Osos. I've only been here 5 years. But I have planted a lot of native plants in the sand because if you're in Los Osos and also a lot of, but not all of Morro Bay, we're on ancient sand dunes. I'm basically am a botanist and I've worked as an ecologist for park districts for decades. But I just moved here 5 years ago and I've learned a lot. And one thing that I learned is how amazing native bees are. Peggy did a great job giving you guys all kinds of background on native plants and native pollinators. So I'm just going to spend about 15 minutes showing you some examples right here, because these are native plants I put in my yard or came up on their own in Los Osos, and native bees that showed up. So mostly I'll be talking about native bees because I'm a fanatic. So let's see. Or do I put it this one? This way. Yeah. Okay, there we go. So I just want to quickly review with you the flower types and how they match somewhat with the different pollinators. So hummingbirds like flowers with long tubes, and they especially like red ones. And if you think about it, a hummingbird has that long bill and then a long tongue that'll stand out further than that. They can get to the bottom of those long tubed flowers to get the nectar in there. So that's why they're going for those. They often are attracted to red flowers. What's interesting, it's not like they only go to red flowers, but some of the other insects, especially native bees, they don't really see in the red spectrum very well. But the hummingbirds can. So they're like, this is mine. You guys don't see this. So it's kind of interesting to know that's one of the reasons they'll frequently go to red. Butterflies. Now, again, think about the butterflies. They like to have a landing pad. They like to land on something that they can put their little tiny feet down on. And then just like this hair streak butterfly. So there we go. Perched on this landing pad with this long tongue. It's even longer than that. And then they'll stick that down into the flower and they'll just basically turn, and they get to spend several minutes there on that landing pad, getting things, getting the nectar in there. They need room for their wings. So it'll often be better if that particular flower is kind of a pad that's open up. Bees tend to like blue or violet flowers, but they will go to a lot of other flowers too. What's different about the bees is they're not only there to get the nectar for the adult, for their energy, but they're also collecting the pollen specifically on their hairy bodies. And Peggy shows some great examples that they carry down into the tunnels where they have their eggs. So they're really focusing on pollen too. And they take that pollen and they get it packed on their body, and then they go underground, and then they groom it off of their body, and they mix a little nectar in with it. They spit it back up, and they make these little pollen loaves, little bee loaves, or bee balls, which Peggy showed. And then they put that in the tunnel. They lay one egg on it, seal it off. Then they go and they do this again and again and again. So they're going after both nectar and pollen, and they're a little different that way than other pollinators. And then we did talk a little bit about all the moths and wasps and bats and people who are pollinators. So keep those different designs in mind. Now, I have spent decades as a botanist and an ecologist, but only in the last few years have I got interested in native bees. And I was like, what is going on there? I don't know, except the other few months ago, I think I kind of put it together. Remember, we're on sand, and 70% of native bees make tunnels underground. Sand's a lot easier to dig in underground than clay. I don't know this, but I'm just wondering is where we're gardening now with our noses close to the ground, if we have a greater possibility of seeing the native bees. And I'll show you a lot of these. This is a native bee digging a little hole in my backyard. This is called a blue orchard bee or a blue mason bee. And this is what it looks like when you happen to see them. A tiny little hole about the size of their bodies. And bees come in all different sizes. So different size holes may be a different type of bee. I think we just did that.
If it's not working, I will do.
Yeah, go ahead and advance it. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to show you again, like I said, plants. This plant, actually, this purple flowered plant is chaparral nightshade. I've tried to put the names here, and I'll have them on the end again too, just in case it's something that you want to remember. This came up on its own in my yard. I'm actually teaching myself what the little seedlings look like. So more and more, a lot of the native plants in my yard are ones that are just coming up on their own. Does anybody else get that happen in their yards? Yeah. Okay. And again, it might be the sand that's making that more possible. I also think there's something about the Los Osos Morro Bay area, even though we've been towns for a while, I don't think we've just gotten graded and rebuilt and industry and roads. I think we haven't gotten as disturbed as much. And that may be why my front yard, it didn't have native plant landscaping in it, I think, for at least 40 years. And they're coming up on their own there. I am planting some, but so this is a native plant that came up in my front yard. It blooms, the nightshades, this particular one starts blooming in January, really early. So the early bees that come out from their type of winter hibernation, they're really hungry. They can find this plant right away. Another plant like that is the manzanita. So I just have an inset here. And you know how the manzanitas have those hanging bell type flowers? And manzanitas also bloom early. So the first bumblebees that come out in January, this is really important food for them. That mama bumblebee, she's going to be the foundress of a small colony. She needs food right away. And then she'll go underground, she'll find a new nest, and then she'll start laying eggs. And then those first few patches of eggs that she lays will hatch out, and she has to feed them. And then they become the workers. And she doesn't have to go outside anymore, but she's got to get food right away. So if you have these early blooming plants, they're really important, especially for the bumblebees. This particular bee is a black bottom bumblebee. You can see this little last segment there. They're pretty common around here, but they're usually only early, like January, February, March is when I tend to see them. And when Peggy mentioned that we try and get flowers in for all seasons, it's not only that you have more food for the bees, but also there's certain species that only come out certain times of the year. So if there's nothing out in January, February, March, you're not going to get any of these guys. So that's why it's important to try and have this long blooming season. They do something called buzz pollination. So what is buzz pollination? We know the bees and the insects go to the flowers and they're often getting nectar, and they might incidentally get pollen on them. With the bees, they're actually collecting it. And then they go to another flower, and some of that incidental pollen on their bodies or stuff that they collected falls off, and it pollinates that flower if it's the same flower that they got the pollen from. So that's kind of the most common way that pollen gets spread. But there's certain bees like bumblebees that do something that's called buzz pollination. So some plants have their pollen in a structure that it's kind of contained. If you can think of it like a salt shaker, so this is what we call the anther that has the pollen in it. Most of the time the pollen is like this dust all on the outside, and anything that brushes it, get it. But some plants aren't like that. If this was one of those anthers, there might be some slits right here in this anther. And the only way to get it out is to shake it out. Guess who does that? If there are vibrations that are at a certain frequency, then that pollen will come pouring out. So when you see a bumblebee, listen to it, and you'll hear it go. And it's just like really fast. And then I'll go to the next flower. It's hitting that specific frequency that is making that pollen come out of those slits onto the bee's body. Is that amazing? Honeybees can't do that. Moths and butterflies can't do that. It's because flowers and bees have evolved together. Many of these structures are just because the flowers are getting the bees to help them out. So that's buzz pollination. And again, it's mostly the bumblebees around here that do it. But another thing to think about is, so I have native plant pollinator garden in my front yard. In my backyard, I have fruit trees and I have vegetable beds and I have a hummingbird garden and I have native plants. I mean, we do different things with our yards, right? So guess what vegetable garden plants need? Buzz pollination. Tomatoes, peppers. I had another good example and I'm forgetting it right now. Yeah, all in that group. So you will get, if you have native bees that you attract to your yard, you will get better vegetables. Is that amazing? Now, I just noticed a few weeks ago, the carpenter bees, I still had a few tomatoes in that were the sun golds that still had flowers on it. There were still a few of the carpenter bees out and they were going to that flower. And what did I hear? So I think that's really cool. And again, if you plant these things in your yard, you're going to start learning and seeing these things. Yes.
Do you think the vibration is unique for the specific plant, like the different, it's a different vibration for the different?
I think it's pretty much in the same frequency. And all those plants I just mentioned, a lot of them are in the same plant family. So they probably kind of evolved, but not all of them. So some different plant families evolved to do this too. Other plants that are really good for bees are the salvias, sages, and the lupins. So this plant on the left-hand side is a San Luis purple sage, Salvia leucophylla, but there's a lot of other salvias that we have here in California and in our area. That's another thing that's really great for them. There's so many different types of salvias. They bloom at different times in the year, so you can get a nice selection in your yard, and they're pretty and they're fragrant. If you look at this, now this is a yellow-faced bumblebee. This is our most common bumblebee. It has yellow all the way down the face and down to the nose. So this yellow-faced bumblebee is here on the salvia, and here's the flower, and you can see what's sticking out here. This is where the pollen is, right here on the tip. So as this bee is getting its tongue deep down into the bottom of the flower where the nectar is, it's also getting pollen out. That's a co-evolution. They have developed this together, basically. Another type of, so salvias are great. The lupins are also great, and they have a special pollinator type flower. So the lupins basically look like this. They have this boat shape on the petals on the bottom, and then they have these petals kind of that stick up on the top or on the side. Well, when a bee lands on this boat shape, and this bumblebee is just backing off, she just landed on it. So when she landed on that, then this structure popped out, and the pollen is in it. So if a tiny bee landed on this, they wouldn't necessarily get pollen, but this bumblebee is getting it rubbed on her body, so that when she goes to the next lupin, because she likes flower constancy, she's taking that lupin flower to another lupin flower. So that's pretty cool. Wanted to make sure. Yeah, we talked about how many different types of, so this particular lupin is the coastal silver lupin, the one with the fuzzy leaves. I actually have an example of it back there. And that grows really well in our sandy soil. Another type of salvia or sage is the white sage. We're probably a little bit out of its original zone here, but many of us like to plant it. It gets big white flowers. The carpenter bees in particular like them. But what I wanted to point out was it gets these stems. Remember Peggy passed around the hollow stems? Even stems where this is pithy, the bees will go ahead and dig in there and nest in it. And I want to show you, I'm gonna pass this around. So I brought actually a stem that somebody dug a tunnel with. So it was a fennel plant, but I'm showing it to you as an example because this is what the white sages do too. When I saw this, I had clipped it and it was just a white pith. And then later on, I saw sawdust on the top of it and I went, ah. And then the next year when I happened to be in there pruning the big buckwheat plant around it, I saw the hole had been opened. So that was probably a native bee that drilled her nest in there. And then the babies came out the next spring. One day I'll go ahead and cut it open. I just haven't done that yet. So not only is the bare soil or sand in our case important, there are some of these native bees will actually use either stems like this, or some of them will actually drill into wood like this. So that's another type of habitat to provide. This bee on the left-hand side is actually called a cuckoo bee. And if you know anything about cuckoo birds, you'll know why they call this a cuckoo bee. It parasitizes on other bees. So let's say this tunnel is open. Mom bee has opened this up. She's starting to lay eggs in the bottom. She's off getting some more pollen for her pollen loaf. And guess who sneaks in here? This lady goes in, lays her eggs in there on the pollen loaves that somebody else collected, and then leaves. And she never even collects pollen. Now, just think about a system that is so intricately evolved like that. So now when I see cuckoo bees in my yard, I think, man, things are getting really rich here. So that's pretty cool. This is a good plant to grow in many places in California, including in the stand. One of the penstemons. And let's look at the flowers. This is a little bit blurry, but you can kind of see it's got a long tube and then like some petals that go up and some petals that go down. But this hole right here, there's some bumps. It's not like a straight tunnel to just fly right into. That's because it's designed for bees. So this is another look at them. Here. So again, the nectar is way down here, right? Bottom of the flower. By the way, flowers don't make nectar. They don't use nectar, right? They evolve nectar to attract insects, specifically bees. Doesn't it just blow your mind? Anyway, so this gal has to get down there, and she has to go through this entryway. And there's some gymnastics involved in that. You have to land on it, and then it's not a straight open hole. You kind of gotta get around those bumps. I often see them land, do a 180-degree turn, and then go in, and then they come back out and they turn. Well, you can't see it in this photo, but the pollen structure is right here on the inside of this petal. So she's got to rub up against it. Again, this is coevolution between the bees and the flowers. So I call it bee gymnastics. So if you're looking at a plant and you're trying to decide if it's going to attract bees, these are the types of things to look for. I also want to talk about annuals a little bit. We stay really focused on the perennials as being the bones of the garden. But if you think about volume of flowers and volume of pollen and nectar, if you can get annuals to grow in between your perennials, you're going to up not only the number of bees you get, but the types of bees you get. And let's talk about, does anybody know what this is?
Yeah.
California poppy. It's all over the place. By the way, do you notice anything different about that besides the insect?
There's
Yeah.
two colors.
Yeah. So often we think of poppies as being this deep orange all the way. And that's where they are in most of the state. Here out on the coast, we have a coastal form that's yellow on the outside and orange in the middle. If you go from here, you'll see this color. And as you go inland in San Luis Obispo, this orange will get in further and further. till you get far enough inland, it's the more common all orange one. Is that cool? For another cool fact about California poppies, they don't have any nectar. What? And yet you will see bees and flies. You'll see beetles swimming around in there. You know, and they come out and they're coated with pollen. Now, pollen is a good source of food for some insects too. And so California poppies and many of our other native plants in the poppy family evolved. They didn't bother having nectar. Somehow they just must have the most delicious pollen that a lot of insects go in there and get it all over their body and spread it. The other thing that I've noticed is, have you ever noticed that that poppies are kind of shiny? They have a little bit of a shiny surface on them. I often see bees just hanging out in the sun there. I think they use that to warm up. It pretty much needs to be 60 degrees or higher and not very windy at all for bees to fly around. And I swear, and I see the male bees, because male bees don't need the pollen, right? They're not raising babies. I see them hanging out in the poppy flowers. And I think they're actually using that to warm up, or it might be a good place to display for the females. So there's different types. Yes, Dennis.
Oftentimes we see poppies closing up in the evening or at night. And oftentimes I see a bee choosing to make that its resting spot overnight.
Can you imagine waking up inside of a California poppy in the morning? So these are behaviors 2 years ago I had no idea about. But as I'm starting to get more native bees in my yard, and again, all these are in my yard, I'm starting to notice this behavior, talk to people and read more about it. So California poppy can either be an annual or it can be an herbaceous perennial, where it seems like it's an annual. It kind of disappears in the summer and then it comes back. They still have a really high value for the pollinators out there. Here's another plant right here. And I actually brought a sample of it back there if you want to look at it closer. It's called a Phacelia. This is an annual in my yard. It's really common in the vacant lots and even the parks around Los Osos, and it is a major bee magnet. And there are other types of Phacelias from this area too. And it'll be there for 3 months, the plant will, then it's gone. But it feeds so many bees in that amount of time, and it reseeds itself. So I think it's a pretty amazing plant. And what's in here right now is a little sweat bee. Okay, another major plant that's great that we can grow are the buckwheats. So lots of different types of buckwheats in this area. One in particular that we have is the dune buckwheat. And it does really well in sand, and it will bring in all kinds of insects, bees and flies and butterflies and wasps. Again, a lot of the really beneficial wasps, you know, and it'll just be covered with that. They're tough plants and they're easy to grow. Oh, so let me tell you what the two bees are on this one. So this one right here, the abdomen is white and black striped. And it's really fuzzy up here on the thorax, the upper back. It's called a cellophane bee. The reason why is when it digs those tunnels, it actually paints the inside of them with this kind of plastic material. It's a cellophane. You know, it just kind of paints it on there, and that's, you know, it what's the opposite of ingest? It egests it back out. Go. Yes, yeah. And that's why it's called a cellophane bee. And the reason it does it kind of waterproofs the cell. And then that means that larvae, when it hatches underground, won't be as susceptible to diseases and in other insects too. And then, oh no, can we move me? Sure, for a minute. Yeah, get rid of me. So this thing is smaller than a quarter of an inch. And I see them frequently. Look at all these flowers. I mean, that's like a house for it. But I frequently see them crawling around in there and they pop up. So this is the diversity that we have in bees here. Very, very small. And this one's called a masked bee because they often have these white patches on them. So thank you.
I think I'll probably have to push, once to the next slide.
Okay.
Let me try. Okay,
And by the way, like, I didn't know what that bee was initially. I probably walked by them thousands of times, but as you start to notice these things in your own yard, you see more of them. So I wanted to tell you about another group of bees called the leafcutter bees, also referred to as mega chile, which means giant jaws. Look at those. And they've got those projections on. Why does it have these giant jaws? Oops. Have you ever noticed these ovals or circles cut out? And they're always on the edge, right? Like, there's more in here. There's some there, and it's always an oval or a circle. And at first you think it's a caterpillar, but caterpillars, they usually don't get that straight. This has been done by a leafcutter bee. Why are they doing this? Any idea?
Yes.
Something to do with the nest, you're right. So this bee will come here to the edge and she'll chomp, 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 chomp. They do it in a couple seconds. Then she takes that nice oval that she dug out. She holds it underneath her like an osprey does with fish. Flies back to the tunnel, goes back into the tunnel. She wraps the bee loaf and the egg in it like a little burrito.
wow.
Is that amazing? The bees go ahead, no idea about this. You will start to see these. Now they only like certain plants to do this, and they really love the Western redbud to do this. Wendy was asking about Western redbud, and I'm like, I don't know how well they do in sand, but it'd be so cool to see these. But they will use other things. They will even use rose petals, chop an oval in it, wrap their baby in it. So talk about highly evolved. So that's another type of bee that we have in this area. Now, back to what Dennis was saying. There's some flowers that open in the sun and close at night every day. Poppy's one of those. So we kind of went by this briefly, but like the female bees do everything in the bee world. The male bees are just born about mid to late summer, and they come out, they hatch, they come out, they breed, they live a few more days and they die. That's all they get to do.
They don't do any domestic chores.
They don't need to do domestic chores because they don't have a house. The females dig the tunnels underground and in stems, but the males don't have a house. So where do they sleep? They sleep in these flowers. Often the flowers that open and close, the male bees somehow know that. So this is a mallow that I have in my yard. You can barely make it out. Here's the wings right here, and there's the head. So, it'll start to close like this in the afternoon. I'll go by sometimes and I'll gently squeeze them. And if you hear it, there's a male bee that went in there to sleep. So that's kind of cool. Again, something I didn't know a few years ago. They will actually sometimes just latch onto a stem with their jaws and just sleep out in the open. And I see them come back to the same place they were the night before. So that's kind of neat to notice that. One other thing that I wanted to point out was, this is a squash plant right here. And it has a special squash specific bee in it. It's called Pollinators. Dennis, am I saying that right? Dennis is.
I don't know how.
Okay. We'll say that's it. You're supposed to say you're right. So some bees have evolved to only pollinate or only use certain flowers. And so squash plants are that example. I don't grow squashes. One came out of my compost, incidentally, and then all of a sudden this new bee showed up. And I learned it, and it's the squash bee. Somehow they found it. So again, the males will sleep in the squash flowers because they close at night. And I could hear the females arrive in the morning from my bedroom window. They knew when the flowers were open and they were there. One other interesting thing about this particular photo. So see this right here? So bees' tongues, they don't go in their head, they actually fold them back underneath their chin like this. And there's several parts, they're often like a tube, and then, you know, little tongue-like pieces that come out. So what this bee was doing, it went down in here to get the nectar. And then after a while, it came up to the top, and it was spreading its tongue parts like this in the sun. That's how they condense the nectar. Is that amazing? Moisture. Yeah, they reduce the amount of moisture so they can actually carry more nectar with them.
Wow.
And they actually sometimes they look like they're blowing bubbles, and they'll do this.
Wow.
So, okay. I wanted to talk about one more group of flowers, and that's the asters, or the sunflower family. And those are flowers that have a big disc in the middle, and then these colorful petals on the outside, like a sunflower. That's a sunflower right there. So this disc in the middle, actually, flower, 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 flower. Those are all flowers. That's 100 flowers right here in the middle. And then each one of these petals has a little flower here. That is a lot of food. So butterflies love these big landing discs. They love all this nectar in there, but so do the bees. And there's one type of bee, this one right here, called a longhorn bee. Look at the size of those antennas. They're almost as long as the bee's body. These come out late summer. Remember I said some bees come out during different seasons? Late summer, and they go right to anything in the sunflower family. They love sunflowers. But this one right here, this plant is a seaside daisy that grows really well in our sandy soils, and a lot of bees like them. This particular bee is a metallic green sweat bee. This was somebody asked me earlier, this is my gateway drug bee. This is the first bee that I saw that I realized it was something different going on. It was in my yard and I went, what? And then I saw it fly into a hole and I'm like, whoa. Knowing nothing about native bees until I met this critter. And let's see, here's another one. Okay, so this is another type of aster. Again, the petals on the outside, the collection of small flowers on the disc. And this is another, it's either a different species of a metallic green sweat bee, or it's the male of that species.
It's a different species.
Okay, good. So again, another type of aster, when you're looking at flowers and thinking, is this a good pollinator? The asters are really good flowers for pollinators. Yes.
What you keep talking about when they go away,
Mm.
do they hibernate?
Yes. And Peggy actually briefly mentioned that. So they don't really hibernate. Most bees, I'm going to go back to this one. Most of these solitary native bees, they just die at the end of their season, but they have laid their eggs underground. And most of these bees are spending almost like 80% of their lives underground. So eggs laid underground, it hatches out, it eats that pollen loaf underground and goes through its insect phases and then goes into some type of metamorphosis. There. I always use the butterfly terms. It doesn't really go into a cocoon. It just sort of goes into a resting stage underground.
You might call that a pupa.
There you go, pupa. That's my buddy over there. And stays underground until the next spring, and then they turn into a full adult and come out. So most bees live less than a year, and they're waiting underground. So they're not really hibernating. They're not going from one year to the other. The bumblebees are a little bit of an exception. Bumblebees have small colonies instead of being solitary. And at the end of the year, they all die except for a few, which were born and bred at the end of the summer. They go spend the winter somewhere. Wendy has an amazing photo of something she just discovered. And they stay under there until January, and then she comes out and she starts the colony all over again. So for the most part, they don't hibernate or they don't spend the winter. Okay.
I was actually planting a native plant and I had moved away the leaves and I had dug the hole and all of a sudden I see this bee that came from underground. And it had been hibernating, I guess, but it was the first time. I'd always heard about ground nesting bees, but I never saw one in
And
person.
this was a few days ago.
Yeah.
So you don't see any bumblebees flying around right now, right? Because most of them have died, but she saw an overwintering one.
These two I had taken pictures of and put them in iNaturalist. So
Mhm.
the one that's all green, it calls a peridot sweat bee. And then the one with the stripes on
Striped
the
abdomen?
abdomen, it
Yeah.
calls a bicolor striped sweat bee.
Okay, yeah. There is sometimes the male and female bees will look a little different. But there's so many, guess of how many species of native bees there are in California?
16.
Can you know that 1,600 species? So it's pretty amazing. Okay, so I'm just gonna finish up with one other thing. And then we'll be here for any other questions that you have, and then we'll help Eddie clean up. Okay, this is a plant, this is a native sunflower family or aster in my yard. It did the sleep creep, and this was the 3rd year leap. I have fabulous stands at the end of the summer. I mean, look at all those flowers.
That's kind of God's gift to the world. We can't kill this one.
It was covered with all kinds of insects. And so I go out on a safari in my yard a couple times a day during the spring and the summer and the fall, just to see what's there. So I want to show you within 1 hour on these bushes, what I saw, I think it was in it was early August. So I'm just going to go through these quickly. So, I don't remember my names. Peggy's gonna help me. This is a West Coast lady. I think this is some type of blue butterfly. Yeah, and this is,
Asparagus?
yeah, that could be it. I wrote it down somewhere. You can tell I'm not as good with butterflies.
We won't remember it tomorrow.
It's a skipper.
Yeah.
Oh, and this might be a sulfur right here.
Yes.
So, 4 butterflies, not bad. These are flies and wasps, which can be pollinators, right? So, look these up again. A syrphid fly or flower fly. This is some other type of fly. I don't know what kind. This is a yeah, and here's another kind of house fly or
It's a kind of.
okay.
Exactly, that. It's the kind of.
You can say whatever you want.
This is called a sand wasp. They're amazing. This is probably some type of caterpillar wasp and this is some type of hornet. Look at how messy this flower was. This hornet was digging in this flower. I don't know what it was doing. Maybe it was parasitizing on something. But so all these guys were there, being in their happy little nectarine.
Red-waisted wasp on the top corner.
Okay,
Is a spider.
spider wasp. Okay,
It catches them. Eats.
spider. Okay.
It gives its babies.
And then these are all bees that were in here. So this is a digger bee. She's got pollen on her scopa on her legs. This is a leafcutter bee. They collect pollen actually underneath their abdomen, and they're so cute when they're dancing around on this flower to get to all those different little flowers and that disc. They stick their abdomen up. They're like, it's just really kind of fun. Here's a green metallic sweat bee. Again, look at all that pollen on her leg. There's another one of those, different type. Here's another sweat bee. Okay, these flowers are all the same size. Look at how small that is. I'm gonna go over here. Long antennas. This is a longhorn bee. Here's our most common bumblebee, the yellow-faced bumblebee, and she actually has this waxy collection of the pollen on her leg called the corbicula. And then there's a honeybee. I guess I haven't shown one honeybee. But I mean, in an hour. That's Asters are really, really great.
I need that plant.
Yeah. I sort of didn't want to put it in there because you can't get it very easily,
Uh-huh.
but let's talk. They're somewhat rhizomatous and you could come over to my yard and chop some out.
Oh,
Again, it's a native plant. And once it gets established, it does really well. So this is again, just the list of plants I very quickly went through. You can take a picture of this. We can find it in another list. But these are all native plants that have done well in the sand in my yard and attracted pollinators. And
oh, I do want to say that I'm recording these and they're gonna
Uh-huh.
be on our YouTube channel within a
Okay.
few days.
okay.
So,
Again, these are ones that I have tested so far. I've either planted them, seeded them, or they've come in on their own. So I know these work in our sand, in our climate, and I know they attract the different types of insects. So those are one, this list will probably keep on growing. And then I just wanted to kind of close. This is another shot of my front yard. This was this May after we had so much rain. And again, I've got plants that are having flowers at different times of the year. There's open ground in there for the bees to nest. Different types of flowers too are in there. So those are all things, and I've planted them, or they've started to grow in bunches, like a 3 foot by 3 foot area. So they can do the flower constancy.